Authority and American Usage is the essay that made me hate David Foster Wallace. You'll have to excuse the clickbait title because it is kind of true. When I read Authority and American Usage, I genuinely felt like I hated David Foster Wallace. And that's what this video is about. It's about terrible arguments, the responsibility of public intellectuals, how we engage with genius, and how we can do better. David Foster Wallace cannot be separated from his work easily because so much of his own personality, voice, and reputation is integral to his writing's overall construction. We come to David Foster Wallace for his display of erudition, his dry wit, and his iconoclastic insights. Much of his work is so enjoyable to read because it's strictly not a dry analysis performed by some no-name professor or bland journalist. No, it's David Foster Wallace. I went into Consider the Lobster completely torn. I had read This Is Water, his commencement speech, and thought it was fine, and two people in my personal life had completely divergent opinions on him. So I was torn. Now I find myself still torn, but in a different way, more skeptical really. I want to begin my discussion of David Foster Wallace by examining his essay, Authority and American Usage, which I read in Consider the Lobster. Nominally, it's a review of a usage guide from Brian A. Garner called A Dictionary of Modern American Usage, but really, this review is a pretext to explore the so-called usage wars. The usage wars are a series of linguistic battles between two supposedly opposing viewpoints, prescriptivism and descriptivism. Prescriptivism is the view that lexicographers should try to establish and preserve linguistic rules, like grammar rules and fixed word meanings and stylistic norms. Descriptivism is the view that lexicographers should try to record language as it's actually used, rather than try to uphold rules that are likely to be baseless or become quickly outdated. Needless to say, this is an extremely controversial debate within linguistics. My goal with this essay is that you don't need to have read David Foster Wallace or have even heard of him. This video will have implications beyond him. Also, if you like videos on philosophy, arguments, and niche, interesting topics, then my channel is definitely worth subscribing to. Normally, I try not to use gameplay for the background, but I did in this video for my own editing sanity. I structure the video as follows. First, I'll cover the specific argumentative points in Authority and American Usage that David Foster Wallace makes which I disagree with. I will provide quotes and needed context so any viewer will understand the debate. Through these points, I will show that David Foster Wallace makes a fundamental error which makes all of his arguments fall flat. Then, I'll cover some more quirky aspects of David Foster Wallace's style, which mostly have to do with dishonest rhetorical techniques. And lastly, I'll talk about David Foster Wallace himself, and discuss his overall reputation. Yes, I know he's dead, but the points I make will still be important as you'll see. Now, let's dig into the essay. The first point I want to discuss happens a little ways in when he is about to dive deeper into descriptive linguistics. Here is the setup before his response. In this age of technology, some descriptivists contend, it's the scientific method, clinically objective, value neutral, based on direct observation and demonstrable hypothesis that should determine both the content of dictionaries and the standards of correct English. Because language is constantly evolving, such standards will always be fluid. Philip Gove's now classic introduction to Webster's Third outlines this type of descriptivism's 5 basic edicts. 1. Language changes constantly. 2. Change is normal. 3. Spoken language is the language. 4. Correctness rests upon usage. And 5. All usage is relative. So, descriptivists try to record how people actually speak and don't prescribe anything. David Foster Wallace goes on to attack these points, but there's already an issue here. This is an introduction to a descriptivist dictionary, and these tenets are basic and polemical. In other words, these points are not argumentative, they are assertive. They inherently lack content because of their basic and pragmatic essence. They lack any appeal for themselves, they just are. David Foster Wallace's choice to use these points, and as we'll see, point to them as the drastic failure that methodological descriptivism is a straw man argument of the worst kind. Why not engage with the arenas where these points are actually developed? It's like when Jordan Peterson critiqued the Communist Manifesto and thought he refuted Marxism. It's laughable. Anyways, here are his responses to these points. Language changes constantly? Alright, but how much and how fast? Notice how this response doesn't exist as curiosity or genuine criticism. It merely points out vagaries in what, again, is an assertive, practical representation of principles. Of course vagaries exist. This isn't an argument. But also, his criticism both assumes that the answer doesn't exist and that it must be decided upon in advance. Wouldn't the rate of language evolution actually be an object of study for a descriptive linguist? Wouldn't linguists have some answers to these questions? It's philosophically sloppy to point to this as a criticism, as if this basic point is the end-all be-all of the field. Change is normal. Same thing. Is Heraclitean flux as normal or desirable as gradual change? Do some changes serve the language's overall pizzazz better than others? And how many people have to deviate from how many conventions before we say the language has actually changed? 50%? 10%? Where do you draw the line? Who draws the line? Again, David Foster Wallace says this as if no practical answers exist. Admittedly, there aren't very clear ways to draw lines here, if at all. But his own prescriptivist position is completely susceptible to this exact criticism too. Who draws prescriptive lines and makes rules? Why? What gives them the authority and where are they getting it from? Wallace's only response to the authority problem happens when he discusses Garner's dictionary, and it has nothing to do with the existence of a true English language or logical coherence. We also see hints of the fundamental error here when he questions what changes serve the language's overall pizzazz and wonders whether Heraclitean flux is desirable. Pizzazz, desirability, these simply aren't categories that a descriptivist is concerned with. They catalog and aggregate. They do not evaluate nor endorse. They aren't trying to make anything better, they try to understand. Spoken language is the language. This is an old claim, at least as old as Plato's Phaedrus, and it's specious. If Derrida and the infamous deconstructionists have done nothing else, they've successfully debunked the idea that speech is language's primary instantiation. Plus, consider the weird arrogance of Gove's 3 with respect to correctness. Only the most mullah-like prescriptivists care all that much about spoken English. Most prescriptive usage guides concern standard written English. Keep the Derrida mention in mind for later. I do tend to agree with this criticism here, though. Descriptive linguists tend to study speech communities, and this may reflect practical superiorities rather than ontological priority, but Gove here asserts that it is the language, and I do question why. Again, there are reasons for this, but I don't find them very convincing. This is a methodological issue, though, and not an argument for prescriptivism, nor a problem with descriptivism's fundamental aim. It's also curious here that he deliberately makes prescriptivist aims seem as if they are humbly trying to make sure that written English remains good and that everything else they don't care about. While this is conspicuously blind regarding his own article's dogmatism, it also doesn't acknowledge the very real ways in which the linguistic rules that prescriptivists make end up getting filtered down. Like, maybe a prescriptivist does just have humble aims, but then grammar teachers everywhere use his or her dictionary and end up thoughtlessly spreading this one guy's opinion. Correctness rests upon usage. Fine, but whose usage? Gove's 4 begs the whole question. What he wants to suggest here, I think, is a reversal of the traditional entailment relation between abstract rules and concrete usage. Instead of usages ideally corresponding to a rigid set of regulations, the regulations ought to correspond to the way real people are actually using the language. Again, fine, but which people? Urban Latinos, Boston Brahmins, rural Midwesterners, Appalachian Neo-Gaelics? Now, as before, this is a question that has practical working answers. Also, correct meaning based on usage, as Gove asserts, is one of Wittgenstein's prime arguments. Meaning isn't some fixed thing out there in the Platonic sense, but rests in the contextual usage of people in a language game. Later, David Foster Wallace fully reprints Wittgenstein's private language argument to support his own prescriptivist position. So, Wittgenstein's language game philosophy is good enough for a full reprinting when he supports your claim, but ignored when it goes against you. And even then, it's one thing to point out practical difficulties in studying contextual usage, as he does when he questions what people are speaking and how fast the language changes. It is difficult, and maybe even impossible to fully taxonomize linguistics, but that certainly doesn't entail abandoning the quest and reversing the claim of entailment back to abstract rules implying correct usage. Meaning does rest upon use. That claim may be hard as a practical object of study, but that doesn't mean anything for its truth value. All usage is relative. Huh? If this means what it seems to mean, then it ends up biting Gove's whole argument in the ass. Principle 5 appears to imply that the correct answer to the above which people is all of them, and it's easy to show why this will not stand up as a lexicographical principle. The most obvious problem with it is that not everything can go in the dictionary. Why not? Well, because you can't actually observe and record every last bit of every last native speaker's language behavior. And even if you could, the resultant dictionary would weigh 4 million pounds and need to be updated hourly. The fact is that any real lexicographer is going to have to make choices about what gets in and what doesn't. And these choices are based on what. And so we're right back where we started. I think this illustrates a huge flaw within David Foster Wallace's overall argument. While he is correct to point out the inevitability of practical judgment being necessitated, David Foster Wallace seems to think that the entire enterprise of descriptivism is lost because it can't attain its own perfection. David Foster Wallace here is guilty of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Because descriptivism is a fundamentally limited exercise, David Foster Wallace would have the whole thing be labeled as a barrel of drugged trout. In doing so, he not only seems to accept prescriptivism instead, which certainly isn't called for, but also ignores even trying to make a case for it. This is like saying we should abandon meteorology because we can't possibly study every single variable at the isolated molecular level, and that therefore we can't truly predict and understand weather systems, so we should just go back to rain dances. Like, no, that's not the case. Next, David Foster Wallace outlines what he believes to be another one of descriptivism's fundamental errors, pointing to its inherent non-objectivity. The point of the analogy is that claims to objectivity in language study are now the stuff of jokes and shudders. The positivist assumptions that underlie methodological descriptivism have been thoroughly confuted and displaced, and it's now pretty much universally accepted that A, meaning is inseparable from some act of interpretation, and B, an act of interpretation is always somewhat biased. We'll come back to the omitted part of this quote, but for now it's good enough to say that once again, David Foster Wallace points to an inherent limit in practicality and dismisses the entire thing on those grounds. But also, David Foster Wallace massively overasserts these points' limiting character. While there is an inherent indeterminacy in interpretation, it absolutely isn't clear that we can't therefore get extremely close to, if not arrive at, a neutral definition of a word or some other linguistic structure. It's not apparent that there is enough space for ideology to sneak in and qualitatively change the meaning of the word as you interpret it to such a degree and on such a massive scale to then claim that their entire project is fundamentally misguided. Because even if a descriptive linguist unconsciously distorts something, other descriptive linguists of different ideologies will likely notice the quirk, compare it to actual usage once again, and push back. That's how science is done, after all. Let me put it to you like this. If we accept, as we should, that all scientific observation is inherently influenced by the ideology of the observer, do we then also dismiss anthropology, psychology, behavioral economics? The researchers in these fields also definitely interpret behaviors of other humans through their own biased perspective. These disciplines fall victim to the exact same problems that descriptive linguistics does. But I sincerely doubt that most people who admit these problems would then go on to argue that their enterprise is inherently lost or fallacious or illogical. Science has limitations, so what? At this point, we have seen that David Foster Wallace not only doesn't bother responding to robust versions of the people he disagrees with, he also acts as if the non-robust version he's responding to is the robust understanding the descriptivists have of themselves. He also points to inherent limitations of the scientific method in order to reject the enterprise itself, or lets the perfect be the enemy of the good. And lastly, we've seen a hint that he seems to genuinely not understand what descriptivism does when it ends up placing something in a dictionary, because he relates it to desirability or pizzazz. He seems to think that there's a normative element to what descriptivism does. Keep this in mind. Before we move into the next section, I want to outline two scenarios I will continually refer back to. These will help us clarify what the real difference between descriptivism and prescriptivism is, and help us understand where David Foster Wallace goes so spectacularly wrong. First, imagine there's a 51st US state called Backwoods Idiot Land, and the people there, who barely constitute even 0.5% of the US population, speak a version of English that inverts typical pronouns, has about 500 words with different meanings, and never leaves an infinitive unsplit. This version of English is still widely recognized as English, but is seen as a kind of idiotic variant of it. A descriptivist goes to backwoods idiot land and discerns the current rules of their dialect to the best of his or her ability. The scientist takes their findings back to the rest of the USA, presents his findings to the descriptive linguistics community. Should his findings be put in the dictionary? A descriptivist would say, yes. This is extremely valuable information. If anyone wants to go there, it would be fantastic to be able to open a dictionary that actually contained information on non-standard usages. However, a prescriptivist would say no, because their usage isn't correct. While it's obviously very questionable what they mean by that, they basically say that including this information is the same as endorsing it normatively. A descriptivist doesn't see it as an endorsement, they see it as scientific information which should be cataloged. Basically, these two have very different ideas of what a dictionary is. A descriptivist sees a dictionary as a kind of record that aggregates information for people to consult. A prescriptivist sees a dictionary almost as an ethical guide to what is morally or normatively correct. Both of these are perfectly legitimate in their own domains, but it's absolutely necessary to see that they are in fact different domains. For a quick second example, let's think about societal behaviors in anthropology. Say there is a prescriptive faction that thinks dictionaries and textbooks should show the correct human societies, and descriptivists think that the textbook should record information. Consider an isolated tribe who kills any outsiders and practices cannibalism. A descriptivist wants to include them because clearly this is valuable information. A prescriptivist won't put it in their text because it's the wrong kind of society, and putting it in makes it seem correct in some sense. Obviously, they should just write two different books, one scientific and one ethical. Keep these two examples in mind because I will refer back to them. Later, David Foster Wallace shows another example of what he sees as the naive scientific realism of descriptivism. I'll reproduce the quote he shows and briefly discuss it, then follow it with his response, which I will then criticize. A dictionary can be an authority only in the sense in which a book of chemistry or physics or of botany can be an authority, by the accuracy and the completeness of its record of the observed facts of the field examined, in accord with the latest principles and techniques of the particular science. This is perfectly consistent with the two situations I just outlined. A dictionary, from the point of view of a descriptivist, isn't authoritative in a normative sense as far as advocacy. It is only authoritative if it records all of the facts and gives the broadest picture possible. Let's also be very clear about what the appeal he makes to physics is really saying. In physics, there are the true physical laws which genuinely exist out there, the scientists who do their best to record them and publish their findings through peer review, and then textbooks that aggregate these findings, and are only authoritative in how accurate of a picture they give of the current scientific landscape. So there is the truth, then the scientists who study the truth, and the dictionaries that record these findings. In linguistics, there is no true language existing in the heavens. The language resides, in an inherently nebulous sense which we discussed earlier, within the speakers of that language. So the linguistic science should be looked at like this when built off the physics textbook approach. There is the true language, which exists in the discourses of the speakers, the linguists who do their best to study the language and its variants, and then the dictionary that aggregates these findings, and is only authoritative in how accurate of a picture it gives of what descriptivists have been able to actually learn. Here is David Foster Wallace's response, broken down piece by piece. This is so stupid it practically drools. An authoritative physics text presents the results of physicists' observations and physicists' theories about those observations. If a physics textbook operated on descriptivist principles, the fact that some Americans believe electricity flows better downhill, based on the observed fact that power lines tend to run high above the homes they serve, would require the electricity flows better downhill hypothesis to be included as a valid theory in a textbook. Just as for Dr. Fries, or Freeze, if some Americans use infer for imply, or aspect for perspective, these usages become ipso facto valid parts of the language. This passage here is what inspired me to make this video because it's just so fundamentally wrong. The issue is, descriptivists don't study linguistic theories, they study linguistic practices. David Foster Wallace thinks that if a physics textbook was descriptivist, it would have to include obviously wrong theories about physics. So, in effect, he thinks that descriptivists would record obviously wrong theories in the dictionary. But that is clearly not true. If a person from backwoods idiotland started sharing their linguistic theories with the descriptivist, he or she wouldn't care because that simply isn't what he or she is interested in. David Foster Wallace's mistake is that he thinks there is a true language that exists out there somewhere, and thus that whenever everyday people utilize language, they are basically propounding their own understanding of that true language. So, in that sense, including their usages is akin to an endorsement, because it's saying that their linguistic theories are worthy of being recorded, and prescriptivists, therefore, as the most knowledgeable authorities on what the language actually is, somehow, should be the only ones who get to include their theories. But, and I actually don't understand how this escaped his notice, this is obviously not what descriptivists do, nor is this how language works. This quote here illustrates a prescriptivist rule. Garner prescribes spelling out only numbers under 10. I was taught that this rule applies just to business writing and that in all other modes you spell out 1 through 19 and start using cardinals at 20. This is a linguistic theory, but it's a normative and ethical theory. A descriptivist analog might be something like, when dealing with the issue of numbers, there exists a variety of norms that we have been able to observe. Academic writers and journalists use cardinals starting at 20. The northern populace starts at 15, while the southern populace starts at 10. Notice how this information doesn't advocate, it catalogs. Sure, one can argue which way of doing things may be better for communication or readability, but any final judgment here will always be subjective. For a descriptivist, the facts of the field are the usages of everyday speakers. These facts of usage are not theories in relation to some true language, but norms that communities have adhered to and should be catalogued for scientific purposes. The truth is that structural linguists like Gove and Fries are not scientists at all. They're pollsters who misconstrue the importance of the facts they're recording. It isn't scientific phenomena they're observing and tabulating, but rather a set of human behaviors. And a lot of human behaviors are, to be blunt, moronic. Try, for instance, to imagine an authoritative ethics textbook whose principles were based on what most people actually do. This is very obviously more of the same laughable error. A pollster records the general population's theories about politics and similar fields. He thinks that a descriptivist is thus recording people's theories. But we've seen above that this isn't true. They record them as examples. With the cannibalistic tribe, a descriptive anthropologist includes it because it is an example of a human society. It's a norm that they have developed, and while it may be abhorrent to most people, that's not what a descriptivist cares about. David Foster Wallace is smart enough to understand that there's a clear correspondence to ethics here, but he conflates descriptivism's mere recording with an ethical endorsement. For a prescriptivist, a dictionary is akin to a kind of ethical textbook, whereas a descriptivist dictionary is more of a psychology textbook. The whole point of establishing norms is to help us evaluate our actions, including utterances, according to what we, as a community, have decided our real interests and purposes are. Granted, this analysis is oversimplified. In practice, it's incredibly hard to arrive at norms, and to keep them at least minimally fair, or sometimes even to agree on what they are. See, e.g., today's culture wars. But the descriptivist's assumption that all usage norms are arbitrary and dispensable leads to, well, have a mushroom. The context here is that statements about mushrooms need to be clear because some mushrooms may be poisonous. And this is certainly true and where prescriptivism thrives, but the important thing to note here is that there has to be a condition attached that descriptivism fundamentally doesn't care about. If you want to be clearer, then look into some prescriptivist advice. But descriptivism only tries to catalog linguistic behavior, not advocate for anything. And as far as establishing norms goes, here again is where he goes wrong. Backwoods Idiotland, with their weird version of English, isn't violating any norm. They have arrived at their own norm. They, through whatever linguistic process they went through, arrived at their version of English, and arrived at what works best for them. Their norm isn't them saying that their version of the language is the best. Their norm only reflects the fact that it works for their own communicative purposes. It's a norm, but it's not a normative theory. I won't go into criticisms of prescriptivism here very much. Wikipedia has a really hilarious list of all the absurd reasons why it tends to fail. I do think it has its place, but it has to be very honest about what that place is. One of the classic prescriptivist rules was don't split your infinitives. To go is an infinitive, and to boldly go is a split infinitive. The obvious question here is why? And this is where descriptivism as an enterprise is necessary for prescriptivism to not immediately get stuck in outdated rules. Splitting infinitives is something most English speakers do, and there are many examples of sentences that actually don't get their meaning across unless the infinitive is split. A descriptivist would notice this, and then a prescriptivist might then be motivated to change their recommendations and investigate when it might be good to split the infinitive, when it might be bad, etc. But without a descriptive assessment, we just have some guy trying to tell people that the way they're speaking is wrong, and not acknowledging the reality of what people are actually able to understand. Prescriptivism is at its best when it's flexible, like modern ethical theory. Prescriptivism is at its worst when it tries to adhere to this Wallacean snoot attitude that every single person is wrong because David Foster Wallace and the prescriptivists are correct. He keeps insisting that by including some information in a dictionary, a descriptivist is advocating its normative truth value, but this is clearly wrong because the mere fact of its existence is the truth value. Now, take a look at this quote, which I'll provide context for after. This is probably the place for your snoot reviewer openly to concede that a certain number of traditional prescriptive rules really are stupid and that people who insist on them are that very most contemptible and dangerous kind of snoot, the snoot who is wrong. And here we have the fundamental, long-awaited for, self-report. This quote comes from a passage where David Foster Wallace admits he sounds scarily like a descriptivist by denying certain prescriptive rules and acknowledging the superiority of non-standard dialects. Which, if you were worried I was over-asserting his dissent with descriptivism, well, there you go. And he does truly sound like one. Why? Because this is the only place where he even partially criticizes prescriptivism, and the endeavor as he understands it almost immediately collapses under its own weight. Why are these prescriptive rules wrong? By what criteria can you say a snoot is wrong? Well, according to David Foster Wallace or another prescriptivist, he would have to say that what they are advocating for is just an ontologically worse way of communicating. But wouldn't that prescriptivist say the exact same thing about David Foster Wallace? So, both sides are accusing the other of being ontologically, normatively worse. How can we ever resolve this issue? We can't. Because what prescriptivism is, at heart, is a relative project that reflects what certain individuals think is best. We can't possibly say which one is better because better, worse, good, and bad can't be assessed on them. David Foster Wallace believes snoots can be wrong because he dishonestly thinks that there is a way to tell what is better or worse when it comes to linguistic constructions, rather than acknowledging that snoots can't be wrong and that they can't be right, but they can argue. It's dishonest because most of his arguments rely on this assumption, but he dresses them up as if they don't. He knows this about himself, he's not blind. Since the only true audience for it is the prescriptivists themselves, it really doesn't matter that their argument is almost euthyphrotically circular. It's the truth because we say so, and we say so because it's the truth. This is performative self-awareness, which, don't you worry, I'll come back to. He gives the obvious self-defeating argument, but doesn't ever address how this immediate collapse of his position makes most of his other arguments fall apart. He's genuinely so close to seeing that prescriptivism should be mere advocacy, and that descriptivists and prescriptivists have completely different projects, but he doesn't see that. Like yes, prescriptivism as he currently understands it is euthyphrotically circular, which he is just as guilty of by saying some snoots are wrong, by the way. And what can you do to avoid Euthyphro's dilemma? You don't try to act as if what you're saying is the objective good, or that the objective good exists. You appeal to actual facts of life and people's intuitions. In other words, you base your work on descriptivist cataloging and not abstract Platonic argument. The hardline descriptivists, for all their calm scientism and avowed preference for fact over value, rely mostly on rhetorical pathos, the visceral emotional appeal. What the descriptivists haven't got is logic. The dictionary can't sanction everything, and the very possibility of language depends on rules and conventions. And descriptivism offers no logos for determining which rules and conventions are useful, and which are pointless or oppressive, nor any arguments for how and by whom such determinations are to be made. Dear God, I hope I don't even have to explain why this is so fundamentally misguided. Like, Descriptivists don't sanction anything. They are, for all intents and purposes, data scientists. It would be foolhardy to not include shopping data from someone who only eats tomato sauce because you think that's the wrong diet. It doesn't matter what the correct diet or shopping list is. That's not what they were trying to do. Why does he think they don't have logic? Why does he think they have to appeal to emotion for their project? Well, it's because he conflates what prescriptivism and descriptivism set out to do. He thinks descriptivists primarily set out with prescriptive intentions, and judges them accordingly. But this is clearly not true, and every single quote he responded to acknowledged the exact opposite. But David Foster Wallace, either purposely or accidentally, misread the other side and couldn't see that they were trying to answer different questions. He couldn't step away from his own viewpoint and attacked the other side as if they shared his exact same intentions. In many points in the essay, David Foster Wallace frames prescriptivism versus descriptivism as a kind of straightforward, conservative versus progressive battle. Here are some quotes that I'll list back to back. Linguistic conservatives are now formally known as prescriptivists, and linguistic liberals as descriptivists. For another thing, the very language in which today's socialist, feminist, minority, gay, and environmental movements frame their sides of political debates is informed by the descriptive belief that traditional English is conceived and perpetuated by privileged WASP males, and is thus inherently capitalist, sexist, racist, xenophobic, homophobic, elitist, unfair. In short, the descriptivists don't have any kind of appeal that's going to persuade anyone who doesn't already have an eat-the-rich type hatred of authority, per se. Whether methodological, or philosophical, or pseudo-progressive, descriptivists are, all and essentially, demagogues. While it is straightforwardly true that descriptivists have made anti-prescriptivist arguments centering around politics, it is a lie to portray prescriptivists as conservatives and descriptivists as populist, leftist demagogues. They aren't. They just aren't. Descriptive linguists don't sanction everyday usage. They don't say it's correct in the normative sense. His identification of the fact that there are political tendencies within the debate is true, but his framing of descriptivists as political or ethical agents is a huge error that is not founded in any of the quotes he gives. Him doing this allows him to dismiss descriptivism by conflating it with a political movement rather than genuinely engaging with its actual tenets that undermine his own ideas. Descriptivists have made political arguments, but these tend to be more anti-prescriptivist than pro-descriptivist, which will make more sense in a second. One may object here and try to say that David Foster Wallace believes in some objective measure of goodness or badness of language, and that, in some sense, prescriptivism is scientific because it catalogs the best way to do things. Not only does this not address any of the problems I demonstrated above, it actually makes his arguments worse, because not once does David Foster Wallace make any kind of argument for prescriptivism in itself. And make no mistake, he is saddled with the burden of proof if he does claim that there are such objective measures. It is nowhere near enough to point out limitations on the other side when you're trying to claim the positive existence of something in the opposite direction. The evidence is already weighted against him. He needs to do more work if he thinks like this. This exact problem is why descriptivists will sometimes make political or emotional arguments. They function to attack the legitimacy of some positive construction of objective better or worse criteria. Like, how can prescriptive rules be better than ours when they are racist or sexist or whatever? They are attacking the moral ground that prescriptivism implicitly stands on but refuses to recognize. So, when David Foster Wallace tries to dismiss the other side as political and rhetorical, not only does he completely mischaracterize their project, but he fundamentally misunderstands his own. In summary, David Foster Wallace continually attacks descriptivism as if it shares prescriptivism's aims and thus fails to appreciate the very clear differences between the two. Now, let's turn to some other problems with his argumentative style and some of his rhetorical quirks. Since I've shown why his argument is fundamentally fallacious, I want to move into an exploration of his rhetorical techniques and whatnot, of which David Foster Wallace is notorious for. His excessive use of footnotes, his wit, his erudite references, etc. We can start with the footnotes because, surprisingly, I don't hate them, and I don't think they do much rhetorical heavy lifting. Perhaps there's a sense in which they serve to consistently obstruct the reader's concentration and subvert his or her rational systems, and I think this can be true. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes informative, sometimes unnecessary, sometimes obnoxious and obstructive, but usually they are harmless and help form his aesthetic identity. His references, though, one thing I noticed, particularly in his more argumentative essays like this, is that he will frequently gesture towards some movement or thinker, alluding to some vague point they made or result they've achieved, but not actually elaborate on the connections. For example, if Derrida and the infamous deconstructionists have done nothing else, they've successfully debunked the idea that speech is language's primary instantiation. Did they actually disprove that speech is language's primary instantiation? This seems very doubtable. How did they do this? If you can list out the entire private language argument in a footnote, why not do something similar here? How exactly does this affect the potential pragmatic priority that speech may enjoy in descriptivist methods? If the focus on speech is a pragmatic choice rather than a scientific choice, then does the argument even matter that much? What is the primary instantiation? And it should be said that Derrida and deconstruction of all things should be explained when making such a strong, grandiose claim. As David Foster Wallace, you could try to do some research, hunt for a characteristic quote, summarize, and actually try to explain one of the only arguments you make that's good. So, you could actually do philosophy and employ robust argumentative techniques, which he was like a philosophy major or something, or you can rely on the laziness of your audience, who you know likely don't have the will or the ability to actually investigate this claim and just move forward with it. You rely on the pedigree of a name rather than a good argument. When discussing the descriptivist scientific goal, David Foster Wallace says it involves an incredibly crude and outdated understanding of what scientific means. It requires a naive belief in scientific objectivity, for one thing. Even in the physical sciences, everything from quantum mechanics to information theory has shown that an active observation is itself part of the phenomena observed, and is analytically inseparable from it. Now, this quote is not great for a few reasons. For one, it assumes descriptivists homogeneously do have a naive belief in scientific objectivity, and aren't aware of the potential flaws of their paradigm. Being surrounded by academics, I can at least anecdotally assure the viewer that far from a naive scientific realism, specialists often exhibit a very skeptical realism that acknowledges its own limitations. I had a game theory professor, one of the best in his field, spend an entire lecture discussing many reasons why economic theory is wrong, and he ended with a very robust, nuanced evaluation of what its wrongness actually means and why it's still useful. Science may have limits, but that definitely doesn't imply that it's futile. That is kind of how science operates. Open a pop science book, and they will all say that scientists love being wrong because they get to do more science. And yeah, as I said above, the allusion to quantum mechanics and information theory is just funny to me. I'm not a physicist, nor an information theorist, so I can only guess exactly what he means here, but I don't know for sure. The problem is that I shouldn't have to presume what he's talking about. It's a very dishonest rhetorical technique to make an extremely broad gesture at two completely disparate fields and say, yeah, look, something generically similar totally happens there, so it happens here too. Doing this, you don't actually give content to your gesture, you just make a vagary that your audience won't be likely to investigate. Make your arguments explicit, but then you'd actually have to dig into the fields and likely expose just how tenuous of a connection it really is. I'm also unsure of exactly what the function of this analogy is here. He could be saying that even in the hard sciences, which are totally objective, there is still an acknowledgement of observer influence. So descriptivism, which is clearly less objective, certainly falls victim to it even more. The problem is again that we don't know exactly what he means here, but even not knowing exactly, we can still knock this down by wondering if physicists who study the things that involve this observer interaction abandon objectivity overall. They don't, you say? Well, maybe that's not what David Foster Wallace is saying. Maybe he's saying that they all abandon a naive belief in objectivity. But where is the evidence for naivete? Other than those 5 basic edicts which look naive by nature, what he presents is a fairly standard view of scientific objectivity coming from the descriptivist that he can't acknowledge as standard because of his own rabid adherence to his dogma. So yeah, sure. Just say they're naive. The cynical part of me can't ignore the suspicion that this, along with the Derrida mention, is just here to make him look smarter and more credible. It's a name drop for a name drop's sake. Here, let me give one last characteristic example. Shortly after saying the previous quote, we have this hilarious line, which I discussed earlier without the now included midsection. The positivist assumptions that underlie methodological descriptivism have been thoroughly confuted and displaced, in lit by the rise of post-structuralism, reader response criticism, and Gaussian reception theory, in linguistics by the rise of the pragmatics, and it's now pretty much universally accepted that A, meaning is inseparable from some act of interpretation, and B, an act of interpretation is always somewhat biased. If this was just a paper to an audience of linguists, I would admit my lack of expertise and move on. But David Foster Wallace chose to print this for a large, non-specialized audience. What does this quote do? It dumps a laundry list of murky, intellectual movements onto the reader with zero explanations. The tactic is obvious enough. It's an overt appeal to authority and not argument. On the face of it, it's already just extremely unlikely to me that very different theories somehow arrived at the exact same counterintuitive conclusions. That's truly remarkable. And further, we are again left with absolutely no equipment to be able to investigate this claim on our own. Imagine if, when I told you David Foster Wallace was wrong, I just listed like 10 philosophers of science and said, these guys basically all disproved him, so he's wrong. You wouldn't believe me, and you shouldn't believe me. If I was an honest writer, I'd take away some page space from my self-indulgent rambling and actually motivate my extremely strong claim. So yeah, that's what I think of David Foster Wallace's displays of erudition. I used to believe that he probably knew what he was talking about, but seeing how disastrously bad he can misinterpret a few lines doesn't make me very optimistic for his ability to synthesize entire academic movements. I also want to discuss his self-awareness. This is something David Foster Wallace does a lot. His verbiage always seems to contain an inherent critical distance from itself. He'll give you a life lesson and then call it a didactic platitude. He'll write a disingenuous essay, but call himself an elitist snoot. I find these to be mostly tactical and performative examples of self-awareness. But in what sense are they tactical or performative? Self-awareness is a largely unquestioned virtue in American culture, and for the most part, it's rightfully recognized as one. Self-awareness is a critical step in the ethical attitude. How can you change your situation and your behavior if you're unable to recognize your own current state? Self-awareness is disarming because it's generally a step away from narcissism and egoism. It sends a good signal. But self-awareness can be weaponized since so many people accept it so uncritically. They see it as a good in and of itself. Well, it's not, and David Foster Wallace will show it. He tends to use self-awareness as a purely self-preservative measure, to shield him from critique. I know this because his self-awareness never leads to any change or action. This can clearly be seen with authority in American usage, where any level of self-awareness that wasn't performative would have led to a completely different opinion. Here are some quotes. "And we snoots know when and how to hyphenate phrasal adjectives and to keep participles from dangling, and we know that we know. And we know how very few other Americans know this stuff, or even care, and we judge them accordingly." Obviously, calling himself a snoot is a self-put-down, as is the acknowledging of their judgmental attitude. Does it lead him to genuinely reevaluate his judginess? Does it lead him to think about what the effects of his judginess might be? Notice here, too, that he said snoots know these things. Correct English is something that one can know for him. We are the few, the proud, the more or less constantly appalled at everyone else. Here we have David Foster Wallace just acknowledging his own elitism without any following attempt to stop being an elitist. Now, there's obviously a sense in which he's just being playful in a lot of these quotes, and I think sometimes it can be fun. But the playfulness does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to his argument. Notice how he entrenches these reactionary, fallacious arguments, first of all, within a book review, which disguises its ultimately philosophical nature. He further frames it as mere historical background, which is necessary to understand his evaluation of the current book, and he dresses his arguments up in playful, witty language that has just enough self-awareness to make the reader believe that David Foster Wallace really isn't making an argumentative essay. It makes it look like he's above all of this. He plays the both sides suck angle, which, as usual, just ends up supporting the side that has the less robust argumentation, that being his own. His above-it-all attitude makes the reader implicitly trust him because it immediately establishes him as the true authority, while obscuring the need for actual credibility or argumentative support. This is also funny to me because, honestly, the true above-it-all position here is the one that they're fighting an unnecessary battle because they both have completely compatible goals, that being prescriptivism and descriptivism. Or at least, they can certainly both coexist. But he doesn't see that, because he ultimately is entrenched in his own side. So, I've shown why some of his rhetorical techniques and quirks do a lot of argumentative heavy lifting. Now let's turn to David Foster Wallace himself, and the problem with genius. A few months before I read Consider the Lobster, I listened to his commencement speech, This is Water. I was pretty charmed by it, but it ultimately passed right out of my mind. Once I finished Consider the Lobster, I re-listened to it, and was shocked at how different my opinion was. It seemed like the compassionate approach he advocated for was less about empathy and more of an intellectual game steeped in disgust. In that speech, he basically advocates for critical thinking being understood as a free, mindful, and empathetic approach to life.
That is real freedom. That is being educated and understanding how to think. The alternative is unconsciousness, the default setting, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing.
But this time, some other passages really struck me. When describing his default attitude in the supermarket, David Foster Wallace says this:
You can choose to look differently at this fat, dead-eyed, over-made-up lady who just screamed at her kid in the checkout line. Maybe she's not usually like this. Maybe she's been up 3 straight nights holding the hand of her husband who's dying of bone cancer. In this traffic, all these vehicles stuck and idling in my way, it's not impossible that some of these people in SUVs have been in horrible auto accidents in the past, and now find driving so terrifying that their therapist has all but ordered them to get a huge, heavy SUV so they can feel safe enough to drive. Or that the Hummer that just cut me off is maybe being driven by a father whose little child is hurt or sick in the seat next to him, and he's trying to get this kid to the hospital, and he's in a way bigger, more legitimate hurry than I am. It is actually I who am in his way.
To me, these quotes reveal a person who so deeply struggled to empathize with anyone but himself that he had to invent the most extreme scenarios in his head to not end up getting pissed off at the world for not going his way. It's a monumental challenge for him to just see people as people and not obstructions. It shouldn't be about deliberately lying to yourself to subvert your own ego. It's about accepting that the world isn't always about you. Some people are actually just being assholes, but you can't essentialize from that one moment. And to be fair, obviously the language here is meant to be hyperbolic and attention-grabbing. And to some extent I'm willing to look past it because of this. It just strikes me as consistent with what else I've pointed out. Earlier I mentioned that I would come back to his wit, which, as used in most of the other essays, was funny, but was nearly always utilized in a mean-spirited and rude manner. There was never any wit that revealed a kind of genuine joy or light-hearted ribbing at someone you felt a deep kinship with. It was nearly always directed at the people around him who struck him as disgusting. Read his essay Big Red Sun, and you'll see that 85% of it is just a cynical observation about how stupid and cringe and gross everything around him is, with little of the characteristic Wallacean insight that I had hoped for. Nope, just cynical, egotistical scorn, and no real point or insight. In Authority in American Usage, David Foster Wallace reminisces about black students confronting him about his blatant disregard for their ways of speaking. I'm going to reproduce the most egregious sections here, with some context. But truly, it's worth finding a PDF online and reading this part yourself. This is what he would say to them in his office. In this country, SWE is perceived as the dialect of education and intelligence and power and prestige, and anybody of any race, ethnicity, religion, or gender who wants to succeed in American culture has got to be able to use SWE. This is just how it is. You can be glad about it, or sad about it, or deeply pissed off. You can believe it's racist and unfair, and decide right here and now to spend every waking minute of your adult life arguing against it. And maybe you should, but I'll tell you something. If you ever want those arguments to get listened to and taken seriously, you're going to have to communicate them in SWE, because SWE is the dialect our nation uses to talk to itself. Whenever people try to tell underprivileged groups that this is just how it is, it always serves merely to reproduce whatever status quo currently benefits the speaker. His appeal isn't logical, it's conservative and lazy. It's conservative because it makes the current system seem natural and demotivates possible change. And it's lazy because it lacks the imagination and the courage to aim for change. He doesn't wonder if the way that the country talks to itself in SWE might be the problem. It might be the problem that it functions in an exclusionary way, and that the black students who come to his office might need to be told something different than, just keep trying to fit in with the white students. If you're good, they'll accept you and might even listen to you. He simply doesn't care. The way things are is the environment that props him up, and anyone who doesn't conform to that will be left on the roadside. Some of these people grew up in homes and communities where SWE was the native dialect, and these black people had it much easier in school. But the ones who didn't grow up with SWE realized at some point that they had to learn it and become able to write fluently in it, and so they did. And, student's name, you're going to learn to use it too, because I am going to make you. He can teach how he wants to teach, but what's important here is the complete lack of empathy he displays. Here is his assessment about a student who heard his speech and filed an administrative complaint. The complainant was, I opine, wrong, but she was not crazy or stupid, and I was able later to see that I did bear some responsibility for the whole nasty administrative swivet. My culpability lay in gross rhetorical naivete. I'd seen my speech's primary appeal as logical. The aim was to make a conspicuously blunt, honest argument for SWE's utility. It wasn't pretty, maybe, but it was true, plus so manifestly bullshit-free that I think I expected not just acquiescence, but gratitude for my candor. The problem I failed to see, of course, lay not with the argument per se, but with the person making it. Namely, me, a privileged WASP male, in a position of power. Thus, someone whose statements about the primacy and utility of the privileged WASP male dialect appeared not candid / hortatory / authoritative / true, but elitist / high-handed / authoritarian / racist. The first thing he says about the student that he verbally abused is that while she was wrong, she wasn't stupid or crazy. For David Foster Wallace, if you are wrong in his estimation, it takes a further clarification to say that you aren't stupid or crazy, rather than the less egotistical sense in which wrong and stupid are independent categories. We also have more performative self-awareness that shields himself from criticism. He assesses his tantrum as logical, blunt, manifestly bullshit-free, and cheekily says that his only error was not seeing that what was called for here wasn't logic, but silly emotions. These are the words of someone who will not allow for others to be correct if their opinion differs from his own. Very often, when people appeal to things like this, common sense, they tend to be revealing more about their own deep biases than anything independent of them in the world. And what bias is David Foster Wallace exposing? He says it himself. He was a privileged WASP male in a position of power. As far as I can tell from my very brief research into his life, David Foster Wallace was raised in a very privileged position and seemed to inhabit that position for the rest of his life, and as you can see in the quote above, chose to continually enhance that position through exertions of the power he was born with. Unsurprisingly then, we also get political takes like this. As long as redistribution is conceived as a form of charity or compassion, then the whole debate centers on utility. And the whole thing goes around and around. Opinion. The mistake here lies in both sides' assumption that the real motives for redistributing wealth are charitable or unselfish. The conservatives' mistake, if it is a mistake, is wholly conceptual, but for the left, the assumption is also a serious tactical error. Progressive liberals seem incapable of stating the obvious truth, that we who are well off should be willing to share more of what we have with poor people, not for the poor people's sake, but for our own, i.e., we should share what we have in order to become less narrow and frightened and lonely and self-centered people. David Foster Wallace uses our language here. He obviously identifies with the position of power. For him, the best way to approach redistribution is basically to appeal to the self-conception of the wealthy. For this reason, it did not surprise me one bit when David Foster Wallace chose to lightly advocate conservative positions in the book. And I haven't even mentioned the abuse allegations. Go read them, they're horrific. In Authority in American Usage, the only times David Foster Wallace genuinely pushes back on prescriptivism are when it clashes with his own convictions or upbringing. I discussed the statement above where he asserted that some snoots were wrong, baselessly. For his upbringing, he was clearly a precocious prodigy in the language arts, but ends up disavowing his prescriptivist teachers because they allowed his prescriptivism to not let him fit in with his peers. Yet what is he doing with this exact attitude? He's letting his blatant conservatism and prescriptivism alienate him from people. So, what does this all mean? He gives bad arguments that fundamentally don't acknowledge the different nature of the other side. He uses dishonest rhetorical techniques to artificially boost his own position. He performs self-awareness rather than reveal earnest awareness of his own flaws and try to change. He substitutes caustic wit for genuine empathetic engagement. He blindly supports the status quo of which he is a part. He reveals that everyone around him seems like an impediment and has to invent insane reasons just to feel empathy towards them. He sees people who disagree with him as stupid by default. He tries to seem above it all, blah blah blah. While I won't claim David Foster Wallace is a narcissist or anything like that, like seriously, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze him, I just think it's at least clear that his writing betrays a serious narcissistic attitude that heavily impedes his own ability to think and be honest. This is the persona that, intentionally or not, people tend to be falling in love with. Now, egotistical people exist, obviously, but not all of them enjoy this very particular reputation that David Foster Wallace and others like him get with words like genius, insightful, erudite, scathing, acclaimed, and so much more. And I won't even deny these. To be honest, I genuinely did enjoy most of the other essays in the book. And I wouldn't be opposed to reading something else from him. And even Authority in American Usage, while rambling, was at least still fun to read in an infuriating way. Seriously, this isn't a hate piece. The essay did make me hate David Foster Wallace, but only for a while. His wit and writing style is genuinely very entertaining, and he is truly capable of making interesting insights. I do not deny that in any way, and it isn't my goal here to say that people shouldn't read him or stop calling him a genius or whatever. What I truly learned from this experience is that we can't let those signifiers be the end of the story. When we engage with someone's opinions and writings, we can't let the image they've cultivated, purposefully or not, allow us to be less skeptical. We deserve better from the smartest and most successful of us. We shouldn't allow someone to perform self-awareness and end up not changing at all. We shouldn't allow someone to publish fallacious arguments and then get lauded as being insightful. We shouldn't let people bury us in buzzwords. If we want to pursue truth and honesty, we need to stop mythologizing genius. Stop putting people on pedestals. Stop giving people a pass because we like them. Geniuses, public intellectuals, thinkers, etc. These are just people. They may be smart, they may be even significantly smarter than you, but they are, at the end of the day, just human beings. They inevitably make mistakes, and we can't let them fly by, but neither should we condemn them forever. Recognizing the greatest of us as humans also means acknowledging their flaws in a realistic way. It means not excusing their behavior because they cultivated an image as being a tortured artist, but also means allowing them to make the genuine effort to change if they try. It means not being blindly adherent to their every word. All this rhetoric is no substitute for a good, honest argument in the end. I also think we should be wary of this brand of infotainment. Increasingly so, we can see flashy, rhetorically rich media that fosters something like a parasocial relationship with the creator, and which uses these tactics to mask shoddy argument and ideological infusion. I see it most on YouTube, where long, nicely edited and produced video essays, unlike this one, are coupled with very suspicious takes, in which I see almost no dissent about in the comments. The comments instead mostly focus on the more superficial aspects and jokes and whatnot. Those things obviously have their place. All I'm asking is that we as viewers approach these kinds of videos, this one included, although it's not well edited, with more skepticism. and that we guard ourselves against being taken in by a nice exterior. This is why, despite everything I may have said in the essay, I don't hate David Foster Wallace. And this isn't an attempt to cancel him or moralize him. In fact, I have my own problematic faves that my first 2 videos covered and who I barely criticized. Basically, David Foster Wallace may have been a genius, and is certainly a talented writer, but to me, that just means he was smart enough to know better, and I can't excuse him for that, nor anyone else like him. We deserve better. Oh yeah, and the dictionary he reviewed? It's good because it's still prescriptivist in a sneaky way. Go figure.